Welcome. This is the impending crisis, 1858 to 1861. We'll begin with the Lincoln-Douglas debates of 1858. Stephen Douglas, senator from Illinois, known as the Little Giant, stood in the middle of the crisis of Union, in the decade of disunion, for he had support in both the North and the South. He was the best hope for unity and union. He wanted to run for president in 1860, but to do that, he had to win re-election to the Senate first. His opponent in 1858 for the Senate was Abraham Lincoln, a lanky, raw-boned former Whig and one-term congressman. Lincoln was a jack of all trades. He had many careers. He had once been a wrestler, and he was a storekeeper. And he also was most recently a self-taught lawyer who represented the Illinois Central Railroad as its legal counsel. It is debatable whether or not among these careers included Lincoln as a vampire killer. Lincoln abhorred slavery, but he was not an abolitionist. His wife Mary was from Kentucky, and his wife's family owned slaves. Lincoln thought that the peculiar institution would die out over time. Like most Republicans, he opposed the expansion of slavery into the territories. And in this race for the Senate, Lincoln challenges Douglas to a debate. Douglas agreed to do 7 debates, a best of 7 series, if you will. These debates took place across the state of Illinois, beginning on August 21st, 1858, and the last one was held on October 15th. Lincoln, in these debates, was tall, plain-clothed, and clean-shaven. Douglas was short, dressed in the finest suits, and also clean-shaven. Douglas looked like the wealthy. Lincoln looked like the people. The most important debate of the 7 was the second debate, the Freeport debate on August 27, 1858. At this debate, Lincoln asked Douglas to reconcile the concept of popular sovereignty, the idea that the settlers of a territory could determine the issue of slavery for themselves, with the Dred Scott decision that said that slave owners could take their slaves anywhere they wanted because the Constitution could not deprive them of their right to property. Douglas, in response to this question, proposed the Freeport Doctrine. And Douglas's response was this: whatever the Supreme Court may have to say about slavery, slavery cannot exist anywhere without police protection. And then Douglas went on the attack and accused Lincoln and his fellow Republicans of being a bunch of abolitionist fanatics. Lincoln then said, well, the basic difference between himself and Douglas is that Douglas was indifferent to the morality of slavery, whereas Lincoln saw slavery as a moral ill. Now, Lincoln overall won these debates, but he still lost the election because Douglas had the votes all along, because in 1858, state legislatures determined senators, not the voters. So Douglas had the votes in the state legislature. Douglas wins re-election. But this race, though, in these debates, they are a prelude to the 1860 presidential election, as Douglas and Lincoln would meet again. Douglas's victory in 1858 also undermined Buchanan's loss of influence in Congress. But Buchanan's main rival in Congress is Stephen Douglas. Douglas kept his job. Meanwhile, many of Buchanan's supporters in 1858 lost their jobs because Buchanan's administration was failing. 1859, John Brown's raid. John Brown had left Kansas, now had come to occupy the federal prison in Harper's Ferry, Virginia, on October 16, 1859. His plan here was to take guns and then arm slaves. Then he is going to set up a stronghold in the Shenandoah Valley and lead slave insurrections into the South. Thus, John Brown took the arsenal at Harper's Ferry by surprise, seized 11 hostages, and then held up in the fire engine house. He tried to trade hostages for freedom, but all he lost was a son in the process. Buchanan's response to John Brown's raid was to send the Army and the Marines to capture Brown. Leading the Marines was Army Lieutenant Colonel Robert E. Lee, and his second in command, Army Lieutenant J.E.B. Stuart. In the capture of Brown, Brown killed 4 soldiers and wounded another 9, but was injured himself before being captured. Brown lost 10 of his men, including 2 of his sons. 7 of Brown's men were captured. 5 escaped to fight another day. Brown was hanged for treason and then conspiracy to incite insurrection. The significance of John Brown's raid in 1859 is that it showed the South that their worst nightmare can come true, that white abolitionists will lead a slave insurrection and arm slaves to kill plantation owners. This raid will set off a panic in the South that will not subside for 2 years. And Southerners believe that all Republicans are as crazy as John Brown. And like Charles Sumner in the Brooks-Sumner fight, John Brown will become a martyr to the abolitionist cause. The 1860 presidential campaign. The Republicans denounced both Dred Scott and John Brown's raid. They also do not support the extension of slavery in the territories. They have a candidate, Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln was a moderate who appealed to abolitionists. He was less threatening to the voters than Charles Sumner from Massachusetts, or William Seward from New York, or Salmon Chase from New York. Meanwhile, the Democrats come apart. April 1860, the Democrats meet at Charleston, South Carolina. Douglas comes with his supporters, and they reaffirm the idea of congressional non-interference with slavery. But Southerners, who hold the upper hand in Charleston, want federal protection of slavery. Buchanan tries to win the nomination. He wants to be reelected. He fails. And after Buchanan fails to win the nomination, the delegates from Alabama walk out. The convention adjourns without a candidate. Northern Democrats reconvene in Baltimore, and they nominate Stephen Douglas. Meanwhile, Southern Democrats meet in Baltimore as well, and they nominate Buchanan's vice president, John Breckinridge of Kentucky. Southern Democrats support a slave code platform. They actually endorse a federal slave code. There's a third party in this race, the Congressional Union Party. It is composed of die-hard Whigs and supported both the Union and the Constitution. They are a Union-first party. They want the Union to be preserved. They want to preserve the Constitution as it reads. Their nominee for president was John Bell of Tennessee. Bell was not their first choice. The Constitution Union Party's first choice was Texas Senator Sam Houston, but Houston was not interested. Instead, he decided to become governor of Texas. There are 4 candidates in this race: Lincoln for the Republicans, Douglas for the Northern Democrats, Breckinridge for the Southern Democrats, and Bell for the Constitutional Union Party. Essentially, there are 2 elections. In the North, it's Lincoln versus Douglas. In the South, it's Bell versus Breckinridge. It would seem that the one candidate that can attract support in both the North and the South would win this election. Douglas tries to do that. He tries to campaign in the South in an effort to unify Democrats. It fails. Lincoln, thus, will win this election because he will win most of the northern states, or where most of the Electoral College votes are. Breckinridge will win most of the southern states, but he will not receive enough votes in the Electoral College because the South doesn't have the votes. Douglas will receive 12 Electoral College votes, and he'll win 2 states, 1 free, 1 slave. Significance of this election. The more moderate candidates in this race, Douglas and Bell, lost to the more radical candidates in this race, Lincoln and Breckinridge. The Democrats have split into 2 groups along sectional lines. You have Northern Democrats and you have Southern Democrats. And with Lincoln's election as president, Southerners have lost power in the White House, something that they've had since Martin Van Buren. Secession. It occurred when a determined minority acted quickly in an emotionally charged climate and carried out most of its program against a confused and indecisive opposition. Once Lincoln is elected, Southern states talk of secession. By the time Lincoln is inaugurated on March 1st, 1861, 7 states have seceded. The first state to go was South Carolina. They voted for secession on December 20th, 1860. South Carolina secedes because they believe their way of life has been threatened. By February 1st, 1861, 6 more states secede: Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and on February 1st, Texas. Texas called a special convention to Austin because Governor Sam Houston refused to sign the secession petition. Secessionist forces triumphed and entered this Confederacy on March 2nd. On March 16th, 1861, they demanded that Sam Houston take an oath to the Confederacy. Houston refused. Houston was evicted from his office. Houston proved to be a Jacksonian to the very end. Union first. Our federal union, it must be preserved. And also, when you think about it, Houston fought very hard, both as a soldier in the Texas Revolution and as a politician in the Republic of Texas, to see Texas admitted to the Union. Houston did not want to see this work undone. On February 7th, 1861, the 7 states that seceded sent delegates to Montgomery, Alabama, and there on February 7th they formed the Confederate States of America. They wrote their Constitution, and it looked just like the United States Constitution, except for 2 things. First, which is on your review sheet, they wrote slavery into the document. Second, they extended the term of the president to 6 years and denied the president the opportunity to run for re-election. Their first selection for president was Jefferson Davis from Mississippi. Alexander Stephens from Georgia was elected vice president of the Confederacy. If you're using the old political labels from the Jacksonian era, you have a Democrat for president in Jefferson Davis, and you have a Whig for vice president in Alexander Stephens. Meanwhile, between Lincoln's election and Lincoln's inauguration, President Buchanan waits and does nothing. Buchanan said secession was illegal, but that he lacked the authority to coerce the state back into the Union. He said he could enforce the law on individuals, but the Constitution did not allow him to enforce the law on states. Jacksonian, Buchanan is not. Buchanan did nothing while the Confederate government grabbed federal strongholds in the South. This included Texas forts that lined the Indian Territory and Forts Phillips and Jackson in New Orleans. But the real battle comes at Fort Sumter, South Carolina. Fort Sumter is sitting in Charleston Harbor. Commander Robert Anderson is refuses surrender to Confederate forces. Buchanan sends a steamer to reinforce Fort Sumter. Confederate forces fire on the steamer and it returns to Virginia. This technically is an act of war. Meanwhile, while 7 states are seceding, Senator John Crittenden of Kentucky tries to be like his old buddy and also enemy, Henry Clay. Crittenden introduces 2 bills into Congress in an effort to save the Union on December 18, 1860. The first bill allowed slavery in territories south of the 3630 line. In other words, extend that old Missouri Compromise line all the way to California. The second bill guaranteed slavery where it already existed. Neither bill had support in either house. The South was not interested because it was ready to secede, and the North certainly was not interested in extending slavery. Crittenden then held a peace conference in February, and there he proposed a constitutional amendment that would protect slavery where it already existed. This bill passed in Congress, but it failed in the states. The irony here is, if the states had passed it, it would have become the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. This amendment that would have protected slavery where it already existed. The irony is that there is a 13th Amendment. It does not protect slavery, but it abolishes it. It was ratified in 1865. By March 4th, 1861, there are 2 questions that have one answer. First one is, how far would Abraham go to preserve the Union? The second is, how far would Southerners go to protect their peculiar institution? And the answer is war, or to be more precise, the Civil War. According to historian James McGregor Burns, here in 1861, this is the only time that American democracy failed, as, quote, the male white voters in 11 southern states decided they would rather fight than allow Abraham Lincoln and the new Republican Party to govern them. This concludes the video on the impending crisis. We will pick up with A Nation Divided in class on Thursday. Thank you, and may the force be with you on your next exam.